Good afternoon. How's everybody doing today? We doing okay? Okay. My name is Justin Hendricks. I'm Executive Director of a thing called NYC Media Lab, and I'm very excited today to lead the next panel. I'm going to go ahead and invite my panelists to come out, Jacob Weisberg and Nancy Miller. And maybe the two of you, Jacob here, and Nancy, I'll put you here. Are you having fun so far? Yeah? What's good about this day is that you really are just, you're being treated to a bunch of different ideas, but from a bunch of excellent people. And I'm very excited at hopefully what that will turn into for you. Hopefully that is going to be inspiration for new startups, inspiration for, maybe even social enterprises. There have been a lot of social issues, big, audacious problems that have been discussed this morning. And we're going to turn our attention right now to one that's related to the discussion that you just heard from the unbelievably amazing Mark Hansen. And we're going to talk a little bit about this problem of fake news, of alternative facts, of propaganda, of misinformation, of disinformation. And we've got two fantastic people to talk about it with, Jacob and Nancy. And I'm going to introduce them maybe in an unorthodox way and let them tell you a little bit about their business and what they do. But we're hoping to have a real back and forth here. But I'm going to introduce them with some things that Twitter trolls have said about them. Okay? So to my left, your right here, is Jacob Weisberg, who's chairman of the Slate Group, a commentator, host of the excellent Trumpcast, and author of a book called The Bush Tragedy. He's been referred to as fake news. Failing Jacob Weisberg spreads liberal propaganda, a total lie. That wasn't actually from our president, it was actually from another Twitter user, but I think that's a good one. And then to my right, your left, Nancy Miller, who's editor-in-chief at Good. She's a former deputy editor at Los Angeles Magazine, senior editor at Wired, a staff writer at Entertainment Weekly. Just won an ASME award, which in the magazine business is a big deal. She'll tell you a little more about that. Nancy, well, with a handle like @good, I'm disappointed by your non-stop political virtue waterboarding. Stop it. So there have been lots of nastier things said about these two on Twitter. I'll leave you all to find those on your own time. But as we go through this topic, I want to try to do it in 3 acts. We're going to spend a little time on maybe the diagnosis, a little time on prognosis, and then a little time perhaps on what types of innovations in treating the problem we can imagine in future. But I'll let Jacob tell you a little bit about the Slate Group so you have a little context for him and his career. Jacob.
Justin, thank you very much. I was going to say I practically am a Twitter troll myself. I troll the president. The Slate Group is slate.com, the website / magazine, and one other main component now, which is Panoply, which is a podcasting startup, which I was involved in launching just over 2 years ago. And we're doing a lot of things in the podcasting space, including building out a technology platform, which is called Megaphone, and creating podcasts, distributing, producing, and selling advertising on podcasts for third parties. I think our most successful show, Panoply show so far, is Malcolm Gladwell's Revisionist History, which is launching its 2nd season in June. But Panoply also distributes the whole roster of Slate podcasts, which is up to about 20 different shows, one of which is my Trumpcast show, which was supposed to be a temporary show last year and has failed to end. But just for purposes of this conversation, Slate from the beginning has been keenly interested in the problem of how you create a successful business model around high quality journalism. And when we started Slate just over 20 years ago, that problem was not yet a crisis, but it was an issue for magazines like the kind I had worked at before Slate. And in the intervening years, it's become a national and international crisis, a crisis of democracy. It's a hugely important problem, and it provides a context, I think, for a lot of what we're talking about.
Nancy, tell us a little bit about Good's business before we get started.
Sure. I'm Nancy Miller. I'm the editor-in-chief of Good. And Good's been around for about 10 years. It is a magazine and media company. We publish a quarterly, which is what you saw behind me. That was the winter issue, which was dedicated to understanding Trump and the Trump administration. The virtue waterboarding, is interesting, because I would say that in honesty, Good built its brand on rational optimism. And right now is a time where I'm finding a certain need for that. So we've been pretty successful since I've been there about a year. And our traffic has gone from, say, 7 million before the election to about 13 million. And a lot of that is due to the desire and need for how to process Trump for the good reader. And the good reader is, a millennial audience and is curious about the world. And we don't pretend to solve the problems, but Good tries to present the information so that people can find a way for them, how do they fix it? So that's Good. And the business is, we have a brand studio, we have the magazine, the website, and then we also have Good Core, which works with nonprofits and other companies to get their message out there. We recently merged with Upworthy, which is another website that you may be familiar with. And so you'll be seeing a Good Upworthy brand merge in the coming weeks.
And so it's fair to say that for both of you, your businesses have enjoyed the Trump administration. Is that correct?
It doesn't feel like enjoying it. I do think it certainly, we usually experience a drop-off in audience after a presidential election, and also ordinarily a shift away from politics to other topics, and neither of those things have happened. And it's been particularly helpful around our membership program. Slate's a free site, but we have a membership program called Slate Plus, which I would certainly encourage all of you to consider joining, which supports Slate and provides a number of benefits, particularly around podcasting and audio, and the growth of that has been tremendous since the election, and that is largely the result of the phenomenon of people who want to know what they can do in response to Trump, thinking that supporting independent journalism is one of the important things to do. So I think much for the reason that the ACLU and the IRC and the environmental groups have had a bump in membership. People have been subscribing to the New York Times, subscribing to the New Yorker, becoming Slate Plus members. And so
I would love for Trump to talk about how much he hates Good, because that would mean a lot for us, for our subscriptions.
It was good news for Vanity Fair, right?
Yeah, it was Vanity Fair.
So let's spend just a few minutes on definitions, because people disagree about what fake news is. If I had to ask you what fake news is, or what this phenomenon is we're on this stage talking about, what do you think it is, Nancy?
Well, I would say that fake news is the intentional creation and distribution of information that is knowingly false in an effort to mislead and profit. And there are many other ways of looking at it, but that's my first instinct, is to describe it like that. And I'm glad that there isn't necessarily a legal definition, because that would be an infringement upon our First Amendment rights, but that's my take, though I'm sure Jake has thought a lot about this too and can...
Well, I think you hit on the core point, Nancy. I mean, I prefer the term fraudulent news because I think partly because Trump has tried to co-opt the term fake news to describe news that's not fake. But really, I think there's a continuum, but at the extreme, the clearest form of fraudulent news is made for commercial purposes.
Yes.
Doesn't necessarily have to be political or about politics. There is fraudulent news about sports. I mean, you can find all sorts of things that are essentially done to try to make money on programmatic advertising, and these are manufactured, whether in Eastern Europe or somewhere else. But there's a continuum, and there's also news that might be described as fraudulent or fake, that mixes truth and falsehood, but that mixes in falsehood knowingly and is done for political propaganda purposes, often spread from abroad as well. But then what I would exclude from that discussion is biased news.
Yes.
Because I think news that is simply distorted or from a different political perspective is not the same thing as fake or fraudulent news.
But so I can't just say, if I disagree with something, that's fake news.
All right, well, so that's what happens right now, though.
Right.
It's become kind of like clickbait.
A bludgeon.
When you, when you don't like something, or something is, even a headline is something that seems to be something that you may disagree with, that's provocative, people will hashtag on our Facebook page, fake news. And they're like, this is bullshit, fake news. And they haven't clicked on it or looked at it yet, but it's become a catch-all for like, this is bogus. It's an emotional reaction.
Right. Can we spin it? So how did we get to this point where people are bludgeoning each other with this phrase? I mean, it's been 20-odd years since Fox News emerged. We've seen this kind of big change, obviously, in the news ecosystem with social media. But wasn't it always thus? Weren't people always sort of claiming that there was plenty of fake news out there, that lots of misinformation?
Well, I mean, here's the brief narrative I would give, is you started to have the breakdown of a common national media culture, which with major established, highly credible news organizations, the networks, plus the New York Times, Washington Post, etc. You started to have increasingly partisan alternatives, Rush Limbaugh on radio, Fox News, and some, though generally less successful, left-wing equivalents, or attempts to create left-wing equivalents of that. What the internet did, and social media have really done, is they've accelerated the ability of people to isolate themselves informationally in more partisan environments. And Nancy works with someone I respect a lot called Eli Pariser, who's the co-founder of Upworthy,
yes,
who is really identified with this idea of the filter bubble. And he wrote a book called The Filter Bubble several years ago, before it had really happened very much. I'm ashamed to say I was a little skeptical of it, because at the time I didn't really see it happening. But what Eli Pariser predicted really has come to pass, and it reflects the human tendency to seek confirmation and to find sources of information that are comforting rather than challenging. Not everybody does that. Slate, my magazine, is sort of premised on the idea that there's at least a minority of people who want to seek out information that will challenge their views. And people very often say they want information that doesn't confirm their biases. But if you put them in a psychology lab, what they tend to do in practice is find information that confirms what they already think.
I mean, we had 72% of Americans who had confidence in their news media in 1976. By 2016, that was down to 32%, 51% among Democrats, and 14% among those who define themselves as Republican. Are we trapped in these filter bubbles, Nancy?
No, I don't think so necessarily. I think I'm reluctant to overstate filter bubbles in some sense, because even Eli would say that a fair number of people still get a lot of their news from television or local news, so however that influences them. I do think that Facebook is limiting, because the stuff you want to like and share is such a personal reflection of who you are, that how our stuff would spread around is if somebody likes it and they share it, and so it reflects who they are. So that will keep people in a filter bubble in that way, and what you see. But it's something I've been thinking a lot about, and I'm hoping that it's not true.
Well, let's talk about, just as we continue in our diagnosis, let's talk a little bit about the role of social media and about the role that the technology companies have played. Because I think a lot of people are looking at, when they want to cast blame for this fake news environment, they want to look at Facebook, they want to look at Twitter, they want to look at Google, and ask, what about these user interfaces, these user experiences, these business models? How has this created this ecosystem?
Yeah, and I don't think the three of them are equal at all, partly because I think Twitter and Google both have a strong allegiance to free expression in the First Amendment, which I think Facebook does not. I think Facebook's not against free expression, it just doesn't care about it. And I think to a lesser extent, same is true about journalism. I think Twitter and Google have a kind of core respect for the function of journalists, in journalism, even though some of what they have done has been undermining business models around journalism. But it's Facebook that's really done it. I mean, the rise of Facebook has been a tragedy for independent media in this country, and I think it's a tremendous threat to free expression. And it's out of negligence. It's not because Facebook doesn't want independent journalism to exist.
Do you think anything's changing though? I mean, Facebook's just announced this huge gift to CUNY Journalism School, for instance. They're changing UX. They're experimenting with ways to flag fake news. Mark Zuckerberg's had a huge change of heart since the election. He's gone out and he's listening tours, etc. Do you think that he?
Well, I don't know about you guys, but I got something in from Facebook this morning that said, like 10 tips on how to spot fake news. And it was, you know, check URLs. Well, Facebook is a walled garden. It doesn't actually encourage the checking and sharing of URLs. There were other suggestions that they had that I thought were pretty basic, and I was a little offended that this was the best way that they were going to try and get me to I understand it's absolutely individual responsibility in some respects, but it seemed a little small in a public gesture of how they were going to battle a significant issue that has been brought to them and said, please help us.
So as we see democracy stumbling around the world, that maybe Facebook saying, please check URLs seems like a little bit not enough.
It may be naive and maybe just, well, this is what we can do right now, and then it's on you to make sure, even though we've built systems in place that you can't actually go and do that as readily because they don't want you to leave.
I mean, this is like the, you know, United Airlines Institute for Passenger Rights, right? I mean, it's a little, it's after it comes after this tremendous merited negative publicity in, you know, in a long period in which Facebook publicly took the position that it had no responsibility for the truth or not of things that were distributed on Facebook. And I just think, I don't think technically or technologically it was that hard a problem. I think if what had been going on had been commercial fraud, in the sense that Facebook's users were being ripped off financially, Facebook could have clamped down on it very effectively. And you know, the way you do it is you have to identify and flag things that are, again, fraudulent, done with an intent to deceive, different from biased news. And you don't ban them. They should not be banned, but they should be algorithmically downgraded, and the customers should be warned about the phenomenon. And Facebook is sort of belatedly doing that now, but it should have been doing it a long time ago.
But well, just to your point, kind of, can we really believe that these technology companies will ever really do anything about this problem? Isn't it in their business models, essentially, to not do anything about it?
And there's now a level of sophistication in place where you can't undo, right? So Google, these algorithms are already in place so much, and they're actually meant to help you filter things so that you get the things that you want. That was the original ambition. I think that ambition was a good one. And I don't mean to put it all on Facebook either. You know, 80% of our traffic does come from Facebook, so we do rely on it in a way, and it's easier now to find people than it was, say, 10 years ago, where you had to just try and get people to come to your site. So I appreciate that convenience. But, you know, sometimes I just go to Sarah Palin's Facebook page just to kind of see how things are going over there. And I click through on those links, you know, just to get out of my bubble, because Sarah Palin's not going to show up on my feed on her own. And it's just, it's enlightening. It's enlightening to, and I don't mean that in a condescending way. It's truly robust information that's being presented that's complete bullshit, that is presented in a way that is so, like, scandalously unfair.
Yeah.
And it's
well, we are in this world.
whimsical.
We have these separate cosmologies almost, where complete hierarchies of fact that you know, go very deep, that are different.
The thing, like, the thing that frustrates me is like bubble versus complete irresponsible bullshit, and that's the part where I'm sure you can speak to this too from a journalistic point of view. As an editor, you're just trying to push through and package things in a way that people want to read them, to get a chance that someone will be interested and will be engaged with your content. You know, Trump is now getting us a traffic bump because we were covering climate change and we were covering refugees in July. people weren't as interested in those. Once you put Trump in front of it, they're interested and they click on it. And that's to our benefit.
So I want to spend just one last topic in this diagnosis section, and that's on the role of state actors in utilizing this environment. So we've been everyone's been reading about Russia and disinformation and propaganda. There have been some interesting things lately around Chinese propaganda and the extent to which that government is involved in manufacturing information for our social networks. What role, or what did the Russians see going on in our media and technology ecosystem that they felt they could take advantage of?
Well, it's a very interesting question, but I mean, the thing I would point out first is this is happening in countries all over the world, and it's a key factor in the transition away from democracy back towards autocracy. And whether you look at Turkey or Hungary or Venezuela or Russia, countries that had functioning democracies or were trending strongly in the direction of functioning democracies 10 years ago and are trending back, and misinformation, fake news, troll armies, all of these things are common practices in all of these places, and it's simply a pattern, and that's part of what's so terrifying about the rise of fake news here, is that we've seen this elsewhere, and the result is when the power of fake news outweighs the real news, you are very unlikely to have a functioning liberal society.
I guess my question is, because it's profitable, right? Yeah. In the United States, it's profitable to distribute fake news, especially on the right. My question is, once it's not profitable, will it recede? And I don't know the answer to that.
Well, you'll still have what I think Justin's asking about, which is the political side of this, which is, Russian military intelligence, the FSB, trying to undermine democratic institutions, not because it makes money, but because that's its purpose, to undermine NATO, to undermine the EU.
Right, strategic gain.
And that's happening, and the same thing, some version of the same thing is happening in France and Germany in the run-up to their elections that happened here in the run-up to our election. And it is, I think, strongly traceable to Russia and its allies like WikiLeaks.
But so we know that Mark Warner, who's leading the Senate Intelligence Committee investigation into Donald Trump's Russia ties right now, has been on a bit of a road show in Virginia talking about cyber hygiene, telling people to mind, whether things they're reading are real, telling them about Russian paid online trolls. To what extent
cyber hygiene.
Cyber hygiene is his phrase.
That's horrible.
That's right. It's a horrible phrase, especially for a man who came from tech. But to what extent do we see some alignment between the interests of these state actors and some elements in the U.S.? What are Breitbart and the FSB rowing in the same direction to some extent?
Well, I mean, amazingly enough, the pattern is there. You will see, Russia has state propaganda. It has Russia Today, which is television. You can get it on cable in New York, amazingly enough. There's, it's on TV all over the world, and it has print publications that are the equivalent. And they are a much more sophisticated version of the old Soviet Pravda, with a direct lineage. And the amazing pattern, which you will see pointed out frequently, is a story that will appear in Russia Today will go directly onto Breitbart or onto other far-right, alt-right news sources. And then because those sources are ones Trump consumes, he'll pick this stuff up. So you've had this phenomenon since the election of Russian propaganda coming out of the president's mouth very quickly. I don't think he's highly aware of it being Russian propaganda. I think he doesn't know it's Russian propaganda. But that's part of the effect of propaganda, is it creates an effective meme that people spread without being witting agents of it.
Well, in the Senate investigation testimony the other day, it was noted that the reason the Russian propaganda had been so successful is because Donald Trump had simply repeated it nearly verbatim throughout the course of the campaign. What did journalists do about that?
Right, so then this is the struggle when there would be the reaction to want to then embed the tweets. You know, you're outraged. People want to read about it. They want to know what Trump is saying, and you don't necessarily have, Good doesn't necessarily have the political and journalistic resources to have someone tell us in investigating Russia. So what do? We would embed tweets and then share the outrage with an angle that, in aggregating this story. And I think that's the challenge for us. How you can responsibly cover an administration that has these tactics that are far more sophisticated, I think, than maybe a lot of journalistic outlets are accustomed to. And then naively reposition them as something that it was Trump said or something Trump did. And then get the likes because people want that sense of that fresh hit of outrage, which we're not trying to feed. But it's also a story. So.
But so I was struck during the campaign. There was a picture at a Trump rally of a man in a T-shirt, and it said, his T-shirt read, "Rope, tree, journalists, some assembly required." You know right now that journalism's on the ropes to some extent. People, while your businesses may be thriving, that in general the sector is struggling. What do you do at this point? How do you contend with this misinformation and the public mistrust?
I mean, I think really the only thing journalists can do is to keep doing their job responsibly and fairly and telling the truth, which is their core responsibility. I think, you were talking a little earlier about the decline of trust in journalism, and it's important context to remember that over this period of time, you see a tremendous, steady erosion of trust in all institutions, whether it's finance and banks, the church, Congress, every institution of government, goes from, before the 60s, Americans sort of had 70+% confidence in everything. And now they kind of have, 40% or lower confidence in everything. So it's not like this has happened to journalism outside what's happened to our relationship to the rest of our society. But it is very, it's very disturbing, and I don't want to turn this into an episode of my podcast, but I do think that there have been things happening in this country around our information environment and politics that I wouldn't have thought were possible. I didn't think there was such a large percentage of the country that essentially lived in a hardened information silo and would be impervious to reality. I didn't think we would have such fundamental debates about facts. I certainly didn't think we would have a president, peddling fictions and having so much acceptance of them. So, that's the world we're in. What can we do? Like a lot of things, but
you were pushing, Nancy, you were pushing this narrative of kind of progressive good, we were all on the way.
Now I'm pretty miserable.
The right trajectory on the moral arc of history, right? What does it mean for you now?
When the night of the election, we had a party, and we were so confident that Hillary Clinton was going to win. We had an entirely different issue planned, and a colleague described it as, Clinton was the Titanic. She was the unsinkable campaign. And what we didn't know is that there were engineers in the engine room rooting for the glacier. So we had to change quickly because Good wasn't necessarily known for being this outrage machine. We were known for trying to promote not an ideal, but an optimism that people could make people active. And it's changed. I didn't actually want my job to be about covering Trump. I'm not a political reporter. I've learned quickly. But that's what the day-to-day job is now. And I shouldn't say I'm miserable, I'm saying that glibly, but it's a challenge that is something that we are constantly, that eats at us, because if I lived by people's T-shirts and what they said, this would be a very dark place and dark world. But I don't think that many of us have illusions of being these noble journalists for this cause. We just work really hard and we try and tell the truth.
But it's a caustic environment for you.
Yes. But it also is one, and it's within our own feeds and our own families, right? And that's the part that we are not having conversations about politics within our own feeds and our own families, because it's gotten so toxic that you can't, unless people agree with you. And I have family members who don't agree with my politics. I mean, I'm personalizing something that I think is a larger issue, and the thing that I can't see yet, which is my job to see, which I'm really concerned about, is the sort of Trump event horizon. You know, I have to be thinking about how we plan to cover the administration moving forward, and we're so caught up in this, you know, I'm up last night writing about North Korea. This is so right here that I'm struggling with thinking about there. And I listen to Trumpcast, and I listen to this podcast as a way of trying to getting a long view. But it's about impeachment 2 years from now. But a lot of it feels, you know, hypothetical, and it feels almost abstract as we sort of strategize what's next. But it's my job to think about what's next and how to cover that. And I'm still trying to get out of the fatigue, the post-election fatigue of trying to cover this in a fair way and still get traffic and still run the business.
So just to pick up on your point about this trend towards autocracy, David Frum in The Atlantic had this cover story about the idea of autocracy a couple of months ago. And he had this bit where he described the media landscape. He was looking back from the moment where Donald Trump wins his second term. It was days after that election, right? So he had invented this kind of this fictional narrative. And he said, Trump critical media do continue to find elite audiences. Their investigations still win Pulitzer Prizes. Their reporters accept invitations to anxious conferences about corruption, digital journalism standards, the end of NATO, and the rise of authoritarianism. Yet somehow all of this earnest effort feels less and less relevant to American politics. President Trump communicates with the people directly via his Twitter account, ushering supporters toward favorable information at Fox News or Breitbart. Is that a plausible future, or is that a description even perhaps of today?
Yeah, I don't know. I read that piece and thought it was, I like you, was sort of particularly depressed by that passage because it seemed to describe something that was plausible. But I would say sort of two things pointing in the other direction. I mean, the first is it's very important to keep a sense of perspective about the freedom and impunity that journalists have in America and how central that is to everything. You know, yes. I'm very involved with a group called the Committee to Protect Journalists, which I would commend to all of you to support. But what the Committee to Protect Journalists does is it focuses on the suppression and punishment of journalists around the world for doing their jobs, and in Mexico, in Turkey, in Eastern Europe, in China, in all, you know, so many huge countries in the world, journalists are jailed, banned, killed, and we have, none of that has happened, none of that, as David Frum says, is likely to happen in America. The threat, such as it is, really is a threat that people lose interest in truthful journalism, that they you know, prefer alternative non-journalism that isn't real journalism. But we don't face the kinds of threats that journalists face elsewhere, and I don't think we're going to. The other thing, you know, to talk about here is, I mean, just think about what's happened this week in politics. Trump has, you know, just dropped a whole series of his most outrageous positions and plans. And now people who are outraged about Trump, like me, are outraged that he's flip-flopped on everything, but he's flip-flopping in a good direction. And it is something that does tend to happen to presidents of either kind, either party. You campaign on a more extreme platform than you govern on, because when you govern, however badly you govern, the core realities around our relationship with China, around the need to not destroy the economy, sort of start to kick in. And, you know, one hesitates to say, you know, Trump is becoming more responsible, but he's realizing, if he didn't realize it before, that a lot of his plans are preposterous, impossible, and, you know, because he has this quality of nothing he says matters very much, he could as easily go back to them, whether in a political context or not. But, you know, this week, he's sort of been moving away. They've been saying nice things about the press this week. You know, that I don't really like that much more, but the truth is it's better that he says he says he respects the press and doesn't mean it, than when he says the press is the enemy of democracy or enemy of the country, which he also didn't really mean.
Right, because I think that's my fear, is that kind of, that autocratic, that cynicism, where you don't believe anything, and you maybe the filter bubble, there's an extension of that you guys have probably, the ideological matrix. So then you have this small network of places where you go to get information, and you don't even believe those. And so that cynicism is something that, good can't possibly survive in an atmosphere where you just are like, screw this, I don't believe anything anymore. So that's something that that's just a psychological and emotional fatigue on readers that Trump could have an influence on in a way that was just too hard to combat on a day-to-day basis of just giving up.
So maybe to turn towards the focus of this conference, which is on entrepreneurship, we've kind of set up this a little bit dire, let's be honest, but on the other hand, we may be going to war with North Korea tomorrow, so maybe being dire is an appropriate
all in those tweets
position. We'll find out on Twitter. What should the entrepreneurs in this room be focused on? What should they be? What type of opportunities do you see if you were sitting in that chair right now? What would you?
It's a crazy moment where there's the fourth estate is saying we have a problem and we really need help fixing it. We can, from my perspective, I can create things that I'm the creator of stories. We try and tell the truth. How do we get that information out there and presented in a way to a mass audience that's effective? And this is where I think I try and think about this is a cry for help, right? And that's where a lot of really great ideas come from at point of innovation. And I think we turn to technology in some effect, is verifying links and those things, but I'm not sure what that is. It's a bigger idea that I'm excited to hear about in a conference like this, because I can't seem to quite wrap my head around that innovation.
I mean, good was to some extent born in a crisis around the financial crisis, around that time. There are always new media entities that are born in these moments of crisis.
Yes, and when Bush, when Good started, it was with Bush and this different kind of fatigue where they wanted something new, and it was just this moment where Good and Obama and this idea of hope. And so it came out of this idea of that there's hope. There are people who are like-minded, who want to move the country forward. We want to fix this. And so I guess this is the front end of that.
Jacob?
I mean, I think there is, tremendous opportunity and tremendous good to be done in developing business models around journalism, information, news. And if I had to be a little more specific, I would say focus on local news, because that's where there is the greatest need, and also I think probably the greatest opportunity. The local news is sort of one of the unsolved problems of the internet. Nobody's figured out how to scale local news, that is to come up with a model that creates news for communities, say metropolitan communities outside the biggest cities, or smaller towns, and then scale it. But surely it can be done, and there has been, I follow this stuff pretty closely, there haven't been that many experiments, and some of the ones going on now are very successful, but a lot of them are around nonprofit or mixed models. There are things like the Texas Tribune and Billy Penn in Philadelphia that are very exciting. I'm not sure whether these models ultimately should be nonprofit or for-profit, but local news is really what has been most thoroughly destroyed by this sort of combination of factors. And without robust local journalism, you don't have accountability, you get government corruption, you get mismanagement, you get bad government. I mean, it's something every community needs, is high quality information to hold authority accountable. And it's just absent because local newspapers have fallen apart and nothing has replaced them. But there's a big potential financial base around local advertising, which is, if you aggregate it nationally, a huge market. And if I were trying to create a news startup right now, I have my own news startups, which aren't so new to worry about. But I would go local.
Are there startups that you admire, Nancy?
Well, I'm not sure if this is defined as a startup, but certainly as an outlet that I admire is ProPublica and its model. I'm trying to think of a distributor that I think is successful. My sense is that there's this gap between people who want to do the right thing and support say, the New York Times. So they know the New York Times is sort of like the ACLU. You sort of know these big names that you know you should donate to, and they're like the Coke and Pepsi of ACLU is nonprofits right now. But I wish there was a way for us to bridge this gap financially of, gosh, I want to do the right thing, and the subscription model somehow feels old and stale. Subscribe to the New York Times. What is it? Could you sponsor a project? And again, this is just like inappropriate brainstorming, I guess, for a panel. But there's just that you know that people want to support you. You just don't, there's a gap in how they can do it that's beyond your, give us your credit card for your subscription to good. That's just not going to work.
Yeah. So let me just ask a maybe even more detailed question then, just to kind of dig underneath. We've got this sort of the local news phenomenon. Do you think that there are, or are you seeing any unique applications of technology to solve any of these problems that you would encourage folks here to look at? We just heard from Mark with the computational journalism, computational propaganda perspective. Mm-hmm. Are there things that you see as market opportunities that would require those types of approaches? Social media verification, automatic content generation, algorithmically generated media, any of that stuff?
Well, I think those are the problems that have been created that we now need to solve. And I actually don't think, I don't take the Silicon Valley approach to this, which is that the goal is to eliminate human interaction. I think you need human editors and writers and journalists, and I think those are going to be among the last jobs replaced by robotics, and I'm not sure they ever will be.
But we'll be able to hear them in this cacophony of robot-driven content.
But it's interesting about the verification.
Yeah.
You and I were talking about this, how with Twitter it kind of turned on itself, where there was the idea of having a blue check verified you as someone that is, a reliable source of information. And then that became sort of framed as liberal media. So now sort of like there are the cooks, you're a blue check. Like, oh, that came from, you're a snowflake. Oh, that's a blue check story. That means that story came from someone with a blue check verified account that's a member of the liberal media and they are not to be trusted. Mm-hmm. So I'm not verified on Twitter.
Yeah, I'm not either.
And I felt sort of like maybe I should get around to doing that. But it's these systems of verifying that ultimately sort of run up against themselves. Because there are sort of sides that need to be figured out in a way of considering what's true and what's fact, because it seems to me that people see that as relative, mm-hmm. and Trump has done that relativity of fact, which is not true.
And even those seem like technology problems that could be market opportunities. That idea.
I see from the entrepreneur perspective, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would. My bias is away from going further down the sort of rabbit hole around social media and social distribution of news, and just looking at other broad opportunities. And the other one I would really want to mention is around audio, because radio is the big undisrupted media market, and it's just a given, I think, that a few years from now people will be consuming audio on demand, which is the way they consume everything else, mm-hmm. including mm-hmm. video and television. And there's an opportunity for increased quality around that. And this moment around podcasting, which is really just audio on demand, sort of reminds me of the early days of the internet, in the sense that there's so much to be built. There's so many things that are sort of necessary for everything to come together. But you have at the core this incredibly enthusiastic and dedicated young audience base of people who love content in this form. New kinds of journalism are being invented around podcasting and audio. You have something similar to the internet, and you just have this radical reduction in the costs of content creation. This moment of creativity when all these things are being done and tried.
And I think as an experience, it helps resolve the issue of it feeling like the information is a distant star, right? The intimacy and integrity that is communicated through a podcast has that human value that makes you engage and trust the person that is talking to you.
Exactly, because they're personal, and it's the,
Right.
you know, it's the voice without the face, which has this sort of intimacy around it. But the other thing about podcasting, I don't know if you've, as Good Magazine, if you guys have thought about this, podcasting weirdly generates love and not hate. Of all other forms of media I'm involved in, generally generate high volumes of hate. That is, when I write an article on Slate, the people who respond on Twitter or wherever else are the people who are angered by it. The people who agree with it don't seem to, most of the time, they don't really need
Right.
to do anything. And
Right.
so the experience for most journalists now is you write something and you then weather the attack.
Yes.
This does not happen with podcasting. When you podcast, and this is experience, you know, I do a very controversial political one, and it's true even for that. People send you these messages about how much they like it, how much they got out of it, sending you suggestions for more things to do. It's weird. I mean, people really have a positive feeling about this form of media. So
I've been wanting to virtue waterboard people through their ears for a long time now, so I think this was a good podcast opportunity for us.
So
Absolutely.
I'm struck that you're almost describing this future for media that's like this sort of artisanal, you know, handcrafted future. It reminds me of maybe some of the artisanal food companies that are here today. Is that right?
Well, you know, journalism was, the journalism I grew up with was much more formal and impersonal. I mean, the way people were taught in my generation to write newspapers, stories, you know, you never used the first person. You would write in an inverted pyramid style. It was meant to be a kind of, I mean, there was better journalism and worse journalism, but it was meant to be a kind of, you know, interchangeable, mass-produced product,
Right.
and the voice of the journalist was not important. And obviously, that's totally different in digital media in all forms, and the kind of subjectivity and personality and directness and colloquialism are all things that grow out of digital interaction, as opposed to, you know, the more mechanical processes of printing and so on. That's all just
And so can that vision, that optimistic vision, can it stand up to big money, big governments that want to pollute the media ecosystem? Are you optimistic?
I am,
Last question.
and I'm looking at it from a pragmatic optimism. We have more, I would say this, that we have more people and more brands who are interested and excited to be aligned with good, and that comes from the business perspective, because of where we've taken a stand with Trump and with the administration, in a way that we were maybe a little rudderless before. So I do think that we have that support, and that people are looking to us to help them define, especially with nonprofits and activism, to define what they do. We're not Mother Jones, but we put it in like a practical, relatable way that people can do something about. So I do think that there is an opportunity there that is untapped. It's just finding out how to approach those and bridge the companies and the nonprofits that want to do the work, and we work with them in helping them share that information. I'm optimistic about that.
Jacob, optimistic or?
I'm generally an optimist about things, but I do think this is a very perilous moment for journalism in America and globally. I think probably the most perilous I've experienced in my life. I think journalism is threatened economically. It's threatened in terms of the ability to have a direct relationship with your audience. If you're a publisher or in a media organization, I think it's threatened politically. And I think it's just very vulnerable right now. I mean, I don't think we're going to lose independent media in this country. But as I was saying about local media, I think we have lost parts of it that we need to get back. And, you know, it would just be very hard to look at this picture and say, this is healthy, this is where we want to be.
Well, just to wrap up, I want to just echo maybe the urgency you've heard from some other speakers. It is a moment of great challenge, and I know that the people in this room are up to that challenge. So I hope that we'll come back here in a couple of years, and we'll be hearing about your new ventures and the new opportunities that you've pursued from today. And hopefully you'll address some of these things, because there's certainly audacious problems, and democracy is in the balance. So, Jacob, fake news, failing, total lie, Weisbert, thank you very much.
Thank you, Justin.
Nancy, non-stop political virtue waterboarding Miller, thank you very much.
Thank
and I
you.
hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.